What if we told you the coming climate catastrophe may not turn out to be as bad as we all thought? Well, that gets your attention. But it's complicated, so stick around for a fascinating discussion on the Growth Busters podcast.
Call a Growth Buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. Here we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. Now, on a full planet, that means it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and the size of our economy. Of course, that includes exploring ways to shrink our own individual footprints, too. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth. Now, for cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. The conversation in this episode is pretty darn fascinating and very, very smart. And it runs about an hour, so I'm not going to do any listener feedback. I'm just going to do one quick current event here. Earlier this week, the Trump administration sent its budget to Congress. And I just have to bring it up because it is such a classic example of why elected officials around the world really are hooked on growth. It's so tough to balance the budget that it is very tempting to rely on growth. Looking at a story here about the budget at Vox.com, written by Emily Stewart, it says President Donald Trump's 2020 budget proposal contains some really rosy projections when it comes to economic growth. Now, the White House is estimating that the U.S. economy will grow at a 3.2% rate in 2019 and then average about 3% growth annually for the next decade. Now, Emily writes that by comparison, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that GDP growth will be 2.3% this year rather than the 3.2%. And it will then average, according to the Congressional Budget Office, 1.7% from 2020 through 2023 and 1.8% from 2024 to 2029. Goldman Sachs estimates GDP growth will slow to 2.5% this year. Morgan Stanley estimates 2.3%. So the White House is very rosy, and they have to be, otherwise the budget looks insane because you just can't borrow that much money. Now, I just have to say, I'm throwing out a lot of GDP growth numbers, and we'll be talking about that in this episode today. GDP is really a lousy metric for success, progress, healthy economy. We are overly obsessed with GDP. And reports like this don't help. It's GDP all over the place. But here's some other interesting things about this classic problem with our elected officials being hooked on growth. Emily points it out nicely. She writes, putting out extra high economic estimates isn't just a Trump problem. It's a Republican one. Jeb Bush in 2015 said he would get to 4% annual growth. Trump, always eager to one-up others, said he would get to 5 or 6%. The GOP has continually oversold how good the tax cuts will be for the economy. And here, she explains why they do it. Trump's over-the-top economic estimates are still a way to try to downplay what his proposals would mean for the debt. Now, these rosy GDP numbers, what they do for the budget is that they give the Trump administration an extra $2.8 trillion of revenue to work with over what the Congressional Budget Office thinks we're going to have during the next 10 years. So that's the power of promising and pursuing GDP growth. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which advocates for fiscal responsibility, is estimating that the Trump budget would add more than $10 trillion to the national debt. According to the group's president, assuming an extra point of growth serves no purpose but to mask the high deficits and debt likely to materialize under the president's budget. Hooked on growth. That's what it's all about. All right, let's get to what you've all been waiting for. Can we relax because climate catastrophe may not be as bad as we're being told? I'm not sure I'm ready to buy that, but one of our guests on this episode pretty much tells us that. It seems that IPCC worst-case scenarios seem to forget peak oil. Limited fossil fuel supplies on the planet could be a factor. But don't break out the champagne. We still have enough fossil fuels to screw things up pretty badly. See what you think. Our two guests for this episode, Dr. James Ward, a sustainability science and ecological engineering researcher and educator from the University of South Australia, and Professor Paul Sutton from the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Denver. Now, we recorded this conversation just a week ago, a week before Ward and Sutton were scheduled to present at the Global Scenarios Forum in Denver, March 11th through 13th of 2019. They planned to present data and suggestions that the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, has up to this point not considered the full range of possible economic scenarios in evaluating various outcomes. The forum will inform scenarios used by the International Panel on Climate Change. Now to the conversation. I cannot believe how lucky I am today to be sitting in the studio with a couple of people who are going to run circles around me in terms of their knowledge and their research and their credentials in growth busting. First of all, we're really lucky to have Dr. James Ward visiting from Adelaide, Australia. And James, I think right now you're associate head of school at University of South Australia. Is that's
current? My current title? Yeah, the titles change from time to time, but yeah, that's it for now.
James has been researching and educating and communicating in the fields of sustainability science and ecological engineering and specializing in limits to growth.
Yeah.
And you've got some very interesting ideas I'm looking forward to talking about. And you are visiting the U.S., and I guess your host in the U.S. is Professor Paul Sutton. Is that why you guys are together?
Yes,
sort of.
Yes, so I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Denver, and I met James on sabbatical visiting the University of South Australia in Adelaide.
That's pretty neat. And Paul, you're doing amazing work, and I can't believe you're just up the road from me in Denver, and I had no idea what you were up to, but you're using nighttime satellite imagery to map and estimate human population distribution, energy consumption, economic activity, urban extent, CO2 emissions, and ecological footprints. And
yes.
You teach, are you still teaching this first-year seminar called Utopia, Dystopia, and the End of the World?
I've tried to move it. I've adapted that class, and it's retitled to Envisioning Utopia Through the Lens of a Well-Being Economy. So James and I are in this NGO called the Well-Being Economy Alliance, which is trying to portray these limits messages in a way that is appealing and attractive to win hearts and minds towards recognizing limits and seeing a world in which we live within limits is actually fun and better.
I just had a conversation not a week or two ago with Hunter Lovins, who
she's in We All also.
Yeah.
We know her, and she's going to be one of the lecturers that, yeah.
Yeah, so you guys are all, I'm glad to see great minds getting together on this. And I guess the main reason, James, that you are that you came to the U.S. is this Scenarios Forum that's coming up.
Yes, next week. Yep, at the University of Denver. So we're meeting up with the movers and shakers behind the shared socioeconomic pathways. This is the economic underpinnings for all of the climate model projections and the emissions that drive those climate projections. So we're going to try and rattle a few cages and challenge the dominant paradigm of growth, because they have 5 main economic pathways underpinning these models, and they all depict growth. The lowest growth is a doubling of GDP. The highest one is a 10-fold increase of GDP, and population growth sort of underwriting all of that. So we want to change that conversation. We want to say, look, is it the equivalent of stepping out into a highway and looking one way and then stepping out? We need to look both ways, and there's the collapse narrative that needs to be considered. At the moment, if you don't consider that, how can you mitigate that risk? It's not even on the cards as a plausible future scenario. And I think what's really interesting is the dialogue that could open up once you start to have a conversation that has both growth and collapse on the table, because suddenly what we've all been calling for, which is a transition to a viable, steady state in the middle of, sensible middle ground, it starts to look like that, because you can see you've got rampant growth, which brings a whole lot of uneconomic kind of costs with it. You've got collapse, which is undesirable, and then you've got a sensible middle ground, maybe even a degrowth to a sort of a simpler, higher well-being existence. And that conversation is completely cut off by only having scenarios that include growth.
Now this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that this scenarios forum isn't a bunch of rogue scientists and economists who are knocking at the door from the outside trying to get the IPCC to listen. This is official input into IPCC reports, right?
This meeting is sponsored by the IPCC, or they're one of the co-sponsors, absolutely. So this is mainstream. James and I will both be presenting things that are a little bit like the emperor, the kid saying the emperor's wearing no clothes.
Aha, okay.
Yeah, so...
But they know you're coming.
Yes.
Yep. It's going to be an interesting thing to actually get these people in a room and say, look, why haven't we got a full spectrum? I mean, history is replete with examples of fallen civilizations. So it's not as though what we're suggesting is a completely unimaginable collapse scenario. Civilizations have almost all fallen, and we have the record to show for it. So we should at least be contemplating that could also be our fate. It'll be great to be in a room with these people and say, why? What? And maybe they started out with the full spectrum, and then maybe their government stakeholders progressively whittled away at those undesirable pathways and created a more palatable set of scenarios. I don't know what led to these scenarios. So it's going to be great. In a week, we'll have an answer to that, hopefully.
Are you expecting that you will, have a positive impact on the outcome of these models?
To be honest, I have a feeling that the response will be, yeah, that's all well and good, but we've already agreed on these pathways. They're already published. They're already being incorporated into the models. And we might be seen as just sort of strange people. You've been saying this since the 1970s.
You might,
with limits to growth. And they might just sort of say, look, it's nice, but the grown-ups have decided that the future is all about growth. Or they might say, actually, that's interesting. We never thought of it that way. In 3 years' time, we're developing the next generation of scenarios and we're going to incorporate this. That'd be really nice. So we don't want to put them offside. But we want to get in their face a bit and kind of say, hey, look, what rational person can believe that a global economy that's already transgressing planetary boundaries can double or more, multiply by a factor of 10. This makes no sense, and we should be at least opening up the door to a new conversation.
It really is so basic, and for someone who might maybe just discovered the Growthbusters podcast and maybe hasn't seen the Growthbusters film, or anyone who is just starting to learn about limits to growth, maybe we should give a quick summary of the fact that what we're talking about is that on a finite planet, perpetual economic growth is both impossible and it's impossible. And it's not even wise to be aiming for that if you're trying to limit carbon emissions.
Limit carbon emissions, have a high quality of life, have a resilient set of ecosystems on which we all depend. Absolutely.
I pitch this to my students in a limits to growth setting, or in a lecture on limits to growth, by saying that growth is viewed as inevitable, desirable, and possible. And it's none of those things.
Yeah.
It's not inevitable because, as I said earlier, we've got a historical record that shows that growth is followed by collapse. And there is no system of any kind, physical, biological, ecological, or human, that grows forever. All systems either grow to a steady state or they grow and collapse. And so the entire physical and biological world supports the idea that growth ends. So
is not inevitable.
It's not inevitable. Growth as a system state is a transient state. Is it desirable? Well, GDP growth is a really poor metric of how well we're doing. So GDP is basically summing up all monetary transactions, and increasingly these transactions are paying for undesirable things: divorces, prison costs, environmental cleanup. We're not better off because these things are happening more and more. So when you actually pull that apart and use maybe a more holistic indicator like the genuine progress indicator, we find that our developed economies like the US, like Australia, basically reached peak well-being in the 1970s. And that indicator, the GPI, genuine progress indicator, hasn't increased since then in 40 or more years. Our GDP has gone up and up and up, but that's been uneconomic growth. So the desirability angle is completely flawed. So it's not inevitable, it's not desirable, and planetary boundaries, we don't have to focus on climate change. We can look at fossil fuel supplies, we can look at biodiversity, we can look at ocean acidification, we can look at land use change and loss of habitat. It doesn't really matter which one of these things we look at. We can see that we're getting close, if not passing the boundaries. So it's not possible. So all those things, that it's inevitable, desirable, and possible, are completely wrong.
Yeah, as long as we're talking about IPCC and then we are talking about climate change, and I don't think I have telling you anything you don't already know, but I think the number one reason why we have accomplished so little in terms of curbing carbon emissions is because we've been unwilling to take economic growth off the table.
Exactly.
No solution is considered if it's going to retard economic growth.
Right. So the dominant message is either that we grow and continue to pollute, in which case we bring about two things. One is that we're all far better off economically and we cook the planet in the process. Or the alternative is that we continue to grow, but we do it in a green way with renewable energy and unicorns and rainbows. And in that case, we're all better off and the planet's happy. And that's basically the two scenarios. So it's the first scenario where the high climate change occurs is then sort of undermined by the fact that it's accompanied by this assumption that everyone's better off economically. So if the sea level rises by multiple meters or something like that, but everyone has 10 times as much per capita wealth and everyone has far more energy at their disposal and things like this, it actually changes our perception. And I think that undermines the ability to see how serious climate change is. If you start to realize that there are finite amounts to how much energy we can sustainably harvest from the planet, and there are finite limits to how much real economic wealth and prosperity we can have, there's enough, but it's a finite amount, then it changes how you sort of view your adaptive capacity. And then people might start to say, well, this climate change thing is actually part of a bigger picture about us needing to change direction from an expansionist mindset. And it's not enough to say, well, we're going to go from that kind of brown expansion to green expansion, and then everything will be okay once we have solar panels on our roofs and electric cars in our driveways, because we're going to run out of places to put roofs for solar panels. We're going to run out of driveways for our electric cars.
Yeah, that's so important. So I'm really looking forward to having that conversation. And for the longest time, in my evangelism out there about limits to growth and about trying to scale back the size of the human enterprise, I really avoided talking about climate change because it was, we were still in the middle of this stupid debate about whether it was even happening or not. And I didn't want to lose half of my audience under the tent, the people who didn't believe in climate change. I still thought that there were plenty of other things going wrong on planet Earth as we outgrew the planet. But it seems like in the last 12 months, suddenly the climate change debate is almost completely over. There's a few nutcases out there who still think that they can somehow legitimately deny it. And so now everyone's attention, well, not everyone's, but a lot more attention is riveted on climate change. And I've been thinking, well, that's starting to look like maybe that's the most urgent of the crises that we have created. And so maybe we should focus on that, but we certainly can't ignore the other things. But I'll bet you guys have a different perspective about that.
James and I have been talking about that to a great extent, because if climate change becomes like the problem and we solve it, right, then we can keep growing, right? We have species extinction, we have land degradation, we have ocean acidification, we have insectageddon going on, and James and I are both concerned that there's one aspect of the climate change problem is the economists who want to push growth love to sell this idea of decoupling. So we can decouple environmental impact from economic growth. And James and I have written papers on the decoupling delusion. There is no evidence that decoupling takes place. So there's, that side, and James started on he didn't get to discussing decoupling, but that's an interesting question. It doesn't happen. But yeah, we are very concerned that climate change, solve that, because electrification is going to happen. I drive an electric car. We might succeed with the energy transition, but we're not going to succeed with the habitat destruction transition, the industrial agriculture, the land degradation issues. And so James and I are both concerned that climate change will be a problem. It's finally getting recognized. It gets solved, and then we can just get back on the growth train. And so a lot of these problems, I think truth passes through three phases. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And then third is recognized as having always been true. And climate change seems to be getting to the recognized as always been true. But the growth question has not gone through those three phases yet.
Yeah, there's this really dangerous assumption that all we've got to do is run everything on renewable energy and we can keep on doing everything that we've been doing. And that's driving me nuts.
Yeah, I think so. We're working on replacing the carbon footprint metric with an equivalent renewable energy footprint. So carbon footprint is, in spatial terms, is sort of how much area would be required hypothetically for forests and so on to soak up our carbon emissions. That's what's driving our global ecological footprint beyond one Earth. Mm-hmm. Nearly 60% of our global ecological footprint is that hypothetical carbon footprint. And we don't have enough forests to soak up all of those emissions. Now, the inference there is that if we switched over to renewable energy, as you say, that footprint would disappear. Mm-hmm. And we would suddenly be living within the biocapacity of the planet. We would then do a bit of redistribution of resources and everyone's happy. But a couple of things. One is, if we don't shake off the growth, then even without the carbon footprint, our numbers would increase, our demand on cropland and on pasture lands and on fisheries and forests would continue to increase, and pretty soon we'd be over one planet. And the second thing is that renewable energy actually carries a footprint, like it or not. It's much better than fossil fuel energy, but it takes space to install renewable energy sources. Now, not a lot of calculations have been done looking at how much space would be required to swap out the carbon footprint with a renewable energy footprint.
Are you talking about the raw materials for storage? And
not even talking about that, but that's another aspect, that, and especially rare earth minerals and things like that, the rare earth metals. But if you need, say, biofuel. Now, biofuel isn't a particularly efficient way to get renewable energy, but certain processes might require liquid fuels. And if we need a substantial amount of area dedicated to growing biomass that we can convert into methane or ethanol or diesel fuels, liquid fuels, that spatial requirement needs to compete with other areas of land. If we can just put solar panels on roofs, that's okay. We're sort of getting a double use of the same footprint because we're using the built environment anyway. Offshore wind turbines with cattle grazing under them is another it's a double use of the space. But we actually need to do these calculations. It might show that it's pretty benign and that what would have been a huge carbon footprint becomes a very small renewable energy footprint. And certainly we're hopeful that that's what it will show, especially with a large amount of electrification of transport. And before we started recording, we had a brief chat about aviation. I think that's an area that requires special attention because there's very little sort of credible discussion about electrification of aviation. So
not happening.
Yeah, the extension cords just get far too long. So we need to have that conversation, and we need to look at things like the coke used in steel and things like that. So there's a lot of things that don't necessarily electrify easily.
Yeah, and just think about all the concrete. If we just have electric vehicles, but we keep on
buildings
growing, then all the concrete has a huge carbon footprint.
Sure. Our colleague who's in the parliament in Italy just says, what? So we can have a traffic jam of electric cars? Right. I want to touch a little bit upon what James is going to present at the conference and what I'm going to present. I'm presenting something that's based on this ecological footprint idea. I'm part of a grand challenge, Impact 2025, urban sustainability group at the University of Denver. And these kinds of things are happening. Regis University is doing this kind of stuff. CU Denver is doing this kind of stuff. Universities and cities throughout the United States are worried about urban sustainability. And I really think we have to think about the ecological footprint, the hinterlands that support cities. But I also think this degrowth message is really important. And so one of what my poster is looking at is, how do we allocate these resources, right? So the city of Denver, and I have an urban boundary that incorporates about 2 million people currently, and it has grown dramatically over the past 30 years. If you accept the ideas of William Rees and Matisse Wackernagel with respect to how much land it takes to support them, and they've disaggregated their study to what is the biocapacity of the state of Colorado, and if you scale back the population of Colorado to live within that biocapacity, the 2 million that are currently in a little boundary around Denver right now would have to be 500,000 people to be sustainable. So it would be a 75% degrowth, which is massive. However, if we could successfully decarbonize, it would only have to go down to 1.75 million, like a 15% reduction. So that's a little more viable. And this is a scary message, even within my urban sustainability cohort. We even get, when you say degrowth, to people that are for a well-being economy and sustainability and social justice, when you say, but we still have to shrink the population. It's a tough message. But I like to quote Yogi Berra, who said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And I think we have to be honest about where we're going. And we actually have to degrow to get within planetary boundaries. And for me, I weigh 215 pounds, and my knees and my back and my whole well-being is better when I'm at 185. That doesn't mean I'm going to chop off my arm right now to achieve my weight. Right? I have to target 185 pounds and then engage in behaviors that get me there. It doesn't have to be this painful, cruel thing, right? And that's a message that I'm trying to figure out how to frame to communicate to people to make it a sustainable and desirable future.
Paul, since you brought up population and you're talking about where we're going, I have something I want you to listen to real quick.
New York City in the year 2022. Nothing runs anymore. Nothing works, but the people are the same, and the people will do anything to get what they need.
This is the police.
What they need most is Soylent Green.
The supply of Soylent Green has been exhausted. Return to your home.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
I brought that out just for you.
Oh, too funny. I mean, I watched your movie, Growth Busters, and it's like, this is my life. the Native American tears, the Cuyahoga River on fire. I grew up in Los Angeles, and the smog was so bad. LA has actually gotten better. We've made progress because of government regulations, right? I couldn't breathe. The smog was so bad. And I became an environmentalist movie when I saw Soylent Green. That was sort of the tipping point, the sort of cathartic realization for me, like, oh my God, this really doesn't work if the population gets bigger and bigger. I remember driving out of Los Angeles to visit my aunt in the Bay Area, looking at sitting in the back of a little Volkswagen, asking my mom, how many people live down there? Where does all the toilet flushing go? I couldn't fathom the size of the human population. And when I saw Soylent Green, it just said, yeah, there's got to be a limit. And then I've met most of the people in your movie. I've met William Rees. I've met Paul Ehrlich. I communicated with Garrett Hardin. I've spoken to a lot of these people. I use Daly's textbook. So Soylent Green, clearly it's a silly premise, right?
I used to think so. For listeners who aren't familiar with it, we'll include a link to that trailer, Soylent Green, what was it, 1968?
I thought it was 72. But maybe it's 68.
Charlton Heston, Edward G. Robinson, Chuck Connors, and it was kind of like Reefer Madness, pretty laughable science fiction movie about a really overpopulated world. But I have to tell you, lately it's starting to seem like it isn't as extreme a view as we thought.
But the movie ends with Charlton Heston telling his boss in the police department, you gotta tell him. Should I give it away? Soylent Green is people. They're basically recycling human bodies into food.
Saturday Night Live isn't on Friday night. This is a great movie to invite your friends over.
Absolutely,
for a Friday
but it
night.
has climate. I mean, here it is, 72, and they're talking about greenhouse effect. Edward G. Robinson is pedaling a little bicycle, and he's got racks of car batteries so that they can have electricity, and the food distribution, and the water, and the security. I mean, in the 1%, right? Remember they had the guy that there's this elite set of people that get to eat meat and they get to eat real food, and everybody else gets to eat Soylent Green.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I show that movie in my dystopia class,
Yeah,
right?
I
And my
would
students
expect.
didn't know it. They hadn't heard of the movie, and I show them this campy old Charlton Heston sci-fi flick, and they're like, they tell me, well, that was weird and creepy. But then after, like a couple weeks after, they're like, I've heard Soylent Green 20 times since I've seen that movie. And I'm just wondering, had I heard it before and not recognized the reference? Right? So it was weird. Now they heard the reference a bunch of times. So it was very interesting. That movie was very poignant for me.
So I hope I didn't interrupt your train of thought and keep you from finishing what you're going to be presenting at the Scenarios Forum. Did I interrupt that midstream?
No, basically I do an ecosystem service valuation, and I kind of do an ecological footprint analysis for the countries of the world. So it turns out, in the population versus consumption debate, I tell people that, okay, let's look at the biocapacity of the nations of the world and the impact of the nations of the world in terms of their PAT function, population times affluence times technology. And I use proxy measures. Nighttime satellite imagery is a very good proxy measure of impact. India produces a lot of light. The United States produces a lot of light. U.S. produces more than India right now. And I do an accounting task for all the countries of the world, and there are ecological debtor countries and ecological surplus countries. And China, India are ecological debtor countries, but so is the United States, most of Western Europe, Japan. They are taking more of the planet than the planet produces in terms of inside their national boundaries. Ecological surplus countries are Australia. There's more people in Shanghai than all of Australia. So Australia has a very high standard of living, a high per capita resource use. However, there's only 25 million Australians, and it's a very big country. And then the Congo, Zaire, many countries in Africa, many countries in Latin America, Canada, Australia are examples of ecological surplus countries.
Yeah, but so much of Australia is just so barren. Is the biocapacity computed pretty accurately?
They're sending a lot of food to China.
Okay.
That's what they export, a lot of food. So does New Zealand.
So let's all move to Australia then. Here we come, James.
So it's an interesting little case study because on just a spatial level, Australia is nearly as big, as about 80% the size of the US, I think, in land area, with 1/15 of the population or something. So you could, and a lot of people make the argument that Australia is sort of nowhere near full. So we can, it's just, as Al Bartlett would say, just open space, yearning for development. And but yes, if you actually were to sort of take a cookie cutter and cut out all of the desert from the centre of Australia, then it looks like a lot more like a sort of an atoll with this sort of strip of
Boomerang.
Yeah, a boomerang.
Coincidentally.
A horseshoe or whatever you want to call it. And it's a lot smaller in terms of the productive area. But still, according to Ecological Footprint Network's calculations, our biocapacity is well exceeding our total footprint. So we are one of these we're one of these surplus countries. We're in credit. And yes, we are exporting a substantial amount of food in addition to that. So, yeah, Australia has this uneasy situation where some people don't want our population to grow because we're having a really good time. Thanks very much.
Well, you're not having a good time in traffic in Melbourne.
No, I guess
Sydney.
I'm bringing my lens from Adelaide, and Adelaide is it's one of the smallest capital cities. It is from once in a while, a politician will stand up and say we're falling behind the nation's population growth rate. So they seem to think that if your growth rate is say 0.8% or something, and the nation's growth rate is 1.1%, that somehow you're going to depopulate. But we sort of point out you're actually still growing. We're still going to double in less than a century. So
Losing the race, though.
Losing the race because Melbourne's going to double before us.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we'll go and talk to the people in Melbourne about the traffic that they're enjoying and how much they're looking forward to being 8 million instead of 5 million in 2030 or whatever is the current projection. It's something like that. Yeah, and maybe we should be celebrating the fact that we're actually enjoying a high quality of life despite the fact that our population growth rate is low. And that if that dropped to zero or even negative towards a degrowth scenario, maybe our quality of life would increase even more.
Maybe we should pay attention to Japan because their population is finally starting to turn.
Right.
It's a very densely populated, way past their carrying capacity country. But everyone says, oh, it's going to be terrible for the Japanese because they're not having enough babies. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's going to work out, and maybe their life's going to get better.
Yeah, I get the sense that the citizens are fairly happy with the situation.
Yeah.
I mean, just the boosters are wringing their hands.
Right. Like I in the urban sustainability cohort, we're trying to figure out what should we measure to measure progress. And we want to look at housing affordability, air quality, water availability, time to commute. And I want to say to them, and I have been saying, okay, what happens to all of those metrics when the population goes down? Housing affordability, there's more supply than demand. Traffic congestion goes down. Air quality, there's less people dumping stuff into the atmosphere. All the things that we care about get better with degrowth, as you well know. But this message is it's perplexing to people. It's like some sort of Zen koan that they just don't seem to get. And we're really interested in hearing from you how to frame that message to get people to get it.
Clearly, I've been very successful.
Yeah. I want to pick up on the Soylent Green. To me, that's an example of a dystopian, fictional narrative. And we've got futuristic fiction, it seems to be in one of two main categories. It's either the dystopian sort of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic Mad Max, Soylent Green kind of scenario, which is, it sort of evokes fear, I suppose, to some extent, or people just don't relate to it. They think that's an interesting fantasy future. Or it's the Star Trek, somehow we've broken through any potential barriers and we've colonized the solar system, or we're just in some sort of utopian flying cars, hovering cities type fantasy future as well. And what we really lack is something in between that, partly because it's potentially hard to dress it up as an exciting fictional narrative, but something in between where we've somehow averted disaster, but we're being realistic about the transition to a lower level of consumption per capita and lower populations and things like that. So the sort of future that Paul's talking about for Denver, for example, post-degrowth, where you're living within your boundaries. It's not flying cars, it's not hovering citadels and spaceships, but it's also not Soylent Green. We need to craft that narrative somehow. I call it the 3 Ds. You've got denial, of course, which maybe fewer people are falling victim to denial, but there are still some. Mm-hmm. And then, as Al Gore said in An Inconvenient Truth, you move from denial to despair, and either way you've got a justification for inaction. But I think too many people are trying to avoid denial and despair, and they're coming up with the third one, which is delusion.
Yeah.
And this is we'll have solar panels, electric cars. Decoupling. We will have decoupled the economy from the environment, and the future is just sort of continuation of the past, but with benign impact on the planet, and everything just gets better and better all the time.
Future's so bright, you got to wear shades.
Right. And we've got to find some space. It's going to be uncomfortable in between those 3 Ds, those 3 sort of axes, that is not in denial of the problem. It's not in denial of there being solutions. The solutions are actually quite simple. Copulate, don't populate, right? And it sounds fun to me. So, but not deluded about how rosy that future could be. So let's say, but then we've got to find it, and then we've got to make that inspiring somehow. I think that's the challenge: is the getting that preferably into a fictional narrative that people can engage with, because they're not. With due respect, there aren't all that many people who are going to engage with this, with us discussing the. I know that's shocking to you.
Drought.
You're looking at me like. Right, and we grateful for anyone who is tuning in, but
that must be why I can't compete with Joe Rogan or some of the bigger podcasts out there, huh?
Hunter Levins is trying to do exactly what James is doing. I mean, we've worked with Bob Costanza and people, this idea of visioning a sustainable and desirable future. And there's specific words to use, and we need images to use. And Hunter has written a book with other people from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance called A Finer Future, which is try to be positive, right? And I think what James is saying, that is what we're struggling with. How do we present this sustainable and desirable future in words and images that is realistic?
That book talked me back off the ledge just a little bit.
Yep.
You know, that not bad, not bad. And
So
I
you've
did not
read it?
expect. Yes, and I did not expect to be pulled away from my despair because it's been growing lately.
And I think that there's a growing sense of impending catastrophe especially in the climate space, and this is another reason why I feel like that it'd be nice to zoom out a bit from climate change and think more holistically about our human predicament and climate. A lot of people are getting really, really concerned that we have 10 years before the disaster strikes, or something. That's sort of a narrative that seems to be out there, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we've sort of passed the point where we can keep the planet below 1.5 degrees, possibly past the point where we can keep it below 2 degrees.
Centigrade we're talking about.
Yes.
We have to mention that here in the U.S., which is closer to, what is that, 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit? Do I have that right?
Yeah, you're about right. I would suggest that James is onto something with his presentation at the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, that I don't think we're going to have this collapse that's going to be as dramatic at everyday things. I think if we fail, we're going to go out not with a bang, but a long series of whimpers, like The Long Descent written by John Michael Greer. But I think something that supports that is James's research at the intersection of peak oil and climate change. So James, I think you should talk a little bit about this idea that we're going to run out of fossil fuels to burn that prevent us from getting onto the RCP 8.5 story.
So did you guys get that? Story? We're going to run out of gas before we fully disrupt the climate.
The metaphor I used, I gave a talk yesterday. The metaphor I like to use is that the community is on the deck of the Titanic staring at the iceberg being catastrophic climate change, and everyone's worried about that we're careering towards this thing. And a very small number of us are down in the engine bay looking at the fuel gauge and saying, we've actually got a more serious problem here, guys. And as the ship gradually runs out of fuel, it slows down and ends up just glancing the iceberg. And so we're still looking at significant climate change, obviously, but maybe not as catastrophic as we've feared in the long term. But yes, pulling back a little bit, how did this research come about? About 10 years ago, I was involved in a climate change study in South Australia, where I am still based. And I had become increasingly aware in the lead up to the GFC of this peak oil phenomenon. I'd read an enormous amount about peak oil and was starting to familiarise myself with the research in that space. And then I found myself in a climate change study, looking at the climate change impacts on a groundwater basin that supported a rural town in South Australia. And I was reading these projections from climate change, and it was talking about fossil fuel increasing all the way to the end of the century. And I thought, well, hang on, I've just been reading a whole lot of information and peer-reviewed studies that say that fossil fuels are likely to peak and start declining really quite soon. And those two stories are very different stories. They can't both be true. You can't have something declining and increasing at the same time, unless you're an economist. So I started to kind of pull on this thread and found that it's just one of these things where you have two scientific communities who just don't talk to each other. You've got a fossil fuel modelling community, and they're the ones who are sort of supporting this peak oil, peak coal, peak gas argument. And you've got a climate modelling community, and they have their own projections of fossil fuel. And their paths didn't seem to have crossed. So I started to try and pull these together and produce some. So I worked with some other colleagues in Eastern Australia, and we developed models of fossil fuels that included all of I thought maybe the problem is that the climate community is doing a sort of a worst case scenario. What if we drill through the ocean floor and we pull out methane hydrates and we burn every last bit of unconventional gas and things like that? Maybe that's the difference. So we had an overly pessimistic group of fossil fuel people thinking, well, we're going to run out of conventional oil and then the economy is going to collapse. and nothing else will get burnt. And so I thought, is that the explanation? And it turned out it wasn't the explanation. And I still don't quite know for sure what the reason is for this big discrepancy. But we remodeled everything in 2015 that included methane hydrates. It included all the coal that was considered technically recoverable as a high estimate, country by country, included unconventional oils and the waxy kerogens that you guys have, that if you heat up the ground for 20 years, it might melt it to the point where you can extract this sort of toxic mess and somehow convert that into liquid fuels, all of the shale gas, all of that stuff. And it still produced something more like a medium scenario for climate change. And that's, as I said, that's nothing to be dismissive of. Medium scenario for climate change, we're talking 3 degrees warming Celsius.
Yeah.
And that's twice the 1.5 degrees that is considered sort of the threshold we want to stay below. But I guess this is sort of in a worst case scenario. If we did nothing, it's impossible for us in such progressive countries like America and Australia to imagine a government not doing anything about climate change, isn't it?
We don't have to use our imagination here anymore in the US.
So hypothetically, imagine if you got a president who didn't care about climate change. And if we had a prime minister in Australia, for example, who brought a lump of coal into our parliament and passed it around, just hypothetically, imagine if that happened.
To demonstrate how tame and not scary coal is.
I mean, I can't imagine a statesman-like person in Australian parliament doing such a stupid and infantile thing. But hypothetically, if it happened and we didn't embrace emissions reduction policies, then a worst case scenario might be 3 degrees. Now, 3 degrees will be glaciers melting, it will be habitats shifting, it'll be all sorts of interruptions to human and non-human life, but it's very different to 6 degrees.
We'll be f***ed, but we won't be gone.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. As we go down the other side of that fossil fuel curve, if we don't come up with alternatives, currently, one of the number one uses of fossil fuel right now is producing food, right? You know, the energy return on investment in food is negative, right? It takes 5 joules of energy to produce 1 joule of food, and 4 joules of that is fossil fuel for pumping the water, creating the soil amendments, the nitrogen, mining the phosphorus, trucking it, tractors, etc. If we go down that curve and we haven't come up with some alternative source of energy to produce the food, then the population problem will start solving itself in a very unpleasant way. Really,
True that, yeah.
We really want to avoid human suffering, and facing degrowth as a realistic goal is a way to avoid human suffering rather than cause human suffering, and that's still a message I'm having a hard time pitching.
Yep. What I would hope that this trying to bring together the peak oil or peak fossil fuel and climate change messages is, if we ignore peak fossil fuel and we think that climate change could be anything from benign to catastrophic, depending on sort of our own brilliance, basically. We have the ability to mine the entire planet for energy. We'll have abundant energy resources, but we might cook the planet in the process. It fosters a view that says there are no barriers to growth, but we might cook the planet. Whereas the peak fossil fuel argument says there are barriers to growth, and we might maybe not cook the planet, but sort of slow roast it, perhaps.
Burn it.
Singe the planet. Pan fry. I'm getting hungry. It's nearly lunchtime. So I think that to me, it's not at all a climate denial. As I said, we're still talking serious climate impacts, but it steers the dialogue more towards the inevitability of degrowth and stabilization. If at best best case scenario is where we have rapid deployment of renewable energy, as our fossil fuels decline, we could be heading towards a nice sort of energy plateau rather than continued growth in per capita energy availability. So we need to have that discussion rather than the mainstream discussion, which sort of says there are no barriers to growth, but the only thing we need to worry about is how much we cook the planet.
So let's say the world is on track to actually finally just leave the fossil fuels in the ground. I know we need information about limits to growth, but I don't think we need it based on limited fossil fuel resources, do we? Why do we need to know about that?
So I think that your you're saying that we're actually on track to just roll out the renewables anyway.
Well, we can hope for that.
Yeah,
Hope for that.
sure. And that's the other thing, that I think that's where the hope lies, because renewables have come down in price to the point where they are now more economic than fossil fuels, certainly in the case of electricity. And as more and more transport becomes electrified, then that will factor through to at least some of our liquid fuel demand. So that could actually mean that the realistic climate scenario is the one where fossil fuels go down simply because they are outdated and no longer required. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's a little bit like thinking, well, you've got a growth and a collapse narrative, and neither of those are desirable. The growth in fossil fuels is not desirable because of the climate change aspect. The collapse due to running short because we didn't realize how finite these things were, that's not desirable. And the central kind of desirable pathway is actually one where we transition into renewable energies. So, yeah, I think that we need to be exploring where all of the potential threats are coming from. And we have a lot of people who are looking in the direction of catastrophic climate change. Mm-hmm. In the past, we had some people looking in the direction of catastrophic peak fossil fuel. Mm-hmm. We've got some people who are looking at a really rosy future of renewable energy. We sort of need to explore the entire future space and try and figure out likelihoods. So I gave a talk yesterday about assigning likelihoods to these different scenarios for the purpose of risk assessment. If you're managing risks, you don't just concerned about the consequence of a threat. You want to know how likely that threat is. So if you're crossing the road, you're assessing the likelihood of a car coming, and you're adjusting whether you cross the road. If there's a car about to hit you, you probably don't step out in front of it. If there's a car that's 100 yards away,
had to convert from kilometers.
Do I go feet? Do I go miles? What am I doing here?
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. So you're making these assessments based on the likelihood of the threat happening. If you didn't care about likelihood of things happening, then you wouldn't even step outside, because there's a risk that as you step outside, an asteroid hits you. So that's the worst possible consequence. It has almost no likelihood. So we're doing those calculations anyway, but in the case of some of these absolutely catastrophic scenarios, we sort of like to abandon the idea that a really catastrophic scenario might have a low likelihood. I think that's something we've got to become better at, is exploring this future space, trying to find out, well, what's likely if we do nothing, then are we likely to get to that catastrophic climate scenario, or are we likely to burn out our fossil fuels without having developed the renewable energy because we weren't looking at it?
So doesn't that make people relax when you would prefer they don't relax about it? Or
that's certainly been a response, and I've had meteorologists come to me and say, look, I don't discount what you're saying scientifically, but I'm not going to pick it up and run with it because it sort of waters down the urgency of climate change.
Yeah.
And I guess to some extent, I'm kind of saying, well, yeah, we sort of want to be as realistic as we can so that we're preparing for the right threat. If I'm managing a resource, and I've heard of infrastructure projects where they're talking about building a power station or some piece of infrastructure, but they want to plan for sea level rise. So let's say it's a power station, and it's below sea level, so they're working out or it's near sea level, how tall the levees need to be to make sure this piece of infrastructure will be safe for the next 150 years, because it's a long-lived piece of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So that's planning for the worst-case climate scenario, whereas that's a power station. The real risk is that there won't be any fuel to go into the power station, right? So that's an example where you need to get the full sort of spread of the risks right, and then say, okay, well now, perhaps we'll still plan for the worst-case climate scenario just in case, because it only costs a little bit more to make the wall twice the height. So they might still do that just as a belt and braces kind of approach. But they might actually, when they do assess all those risks, they realize, well, in 30 years' time, no one's going to be using coal. So perhaps this whole idea is a complete waste of time, and we'll invest the money in offshore wind or something like that, or onshore solar or whatever, or solar thermal.
Maintaining biodiversity.
Right.
That you depend on in a different way.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe you were just going to say, well, I'm talking about this because it's the truth, and I'm a scientist, not a PR person. But I see it's more nuanced than that.
Right.
Yeah. And there is some value to knowing that, for sure. Interesting. In your educating of the world about these limits? Do you talk about other resources too, or are you just focusing on fossil fuels in your work?
We've applied the same model. It's a versatile mathematical model of non-renewable resources, and it can be applied to oil fields and mines. So it's been mostly applied to fossil fuels, but the mining part of the model can be applied and has been applied to phosphorus, to iron ore. We did a paper on helium. I think they might have done copper. I haven't been involved in every single one of those studies, but I was in the iron ore study. So the same story comes up. Exponential growth is incredibly powerful, and so as our populations increase and our urbanization increases, and we want more skyscrapers and more roads and more reinforcement for our concrete, there's a real possibility of, within the next few decades, the world reaching a substantial critical steel shortage because of iron ore. Now, economists and geologists will dismiss that because they'll say the price will go up. We'll reclassify
what is recoverable,
what's currently a subgrade, and then we'll just start mining bigger and bigger, digging bigger and bigger holes in the ground. Now then, what that brings is it brings greater environmental cost, because what used to be a relatively small hole in the ground that you pulled out high quality ore, you got the iron out, and then you had a pile of rock, you now need an enormous hole in the ground to get the same amount of iron.
That's great. GDP goes up.
It does, yeah. And then maybe we can crush the rock to make more building materials and mix it with cement and then reinforce it with steel. This is, I guess, speaking to the flawed thinking of... And I guess, from my point of view, all of these things end up with the same common message, is that we've got to get away from an expansionist kind of frontier 1800s mindset, 1700s mindset that says if we reach these boundaries, we're going to just go and colonize somewhere else or cut down some more trees. And we seem to still have that frontier mindset. And the last frontier is the planet. We're at the planetary boundary now. We can't go beyond that. As much as people like Elon Musk would have us believe we can just hop on a spaceship in a few years' time and go and colonize Mars. Not a lot of food on Mars at the moment.
No, but you mentioned Star Trek, and I keep thinking the vision of those people like Richard Branson is that we'll become the Borg, that we will just go and rape other planets. We'll never stop.
Well, I think if we stick to the economic system that we have, that's exactly what will happen. I mean, one of the things I try and do as an academic is get us to look honestly at the value of our planet and its ecosystem services, and how the scientists and the media have failed to communicate how incredibly valuable they are and how our civilization, our economy, and our very lives depend on this planet and its ecosystem services. And the economists in the business community have successfully used faulty logic and magical thinking into not getting us to recognize everything that James is talking about and how dependent we are on nature. And I use a little story called Kill All the Bees, a modest proposal in the spirit of Jonathan Swift, to sort of expose how the economic worldview doesn't get it. Right? So ecosystem services are things that nature does for us for free, right? And they're really important to us. And pollination is one of those ecosystem services most people get. Bees buzz around and pollinate our crops, many food crops, but also natural crops that we may not appreciate the value of. But if they went extinct, and there's reasons to believe they might go extinct, varroa mites, glyphosates, who knows what, nicotinoid pesticides, we could kill all the bees. We would have to hand pollinate crops. And so it's been estimated to be worth $400 billion a year, the value of ecosystem services, right? These are other things that we have to think about. And if bees went extinct, we'd have to hand pollinate crops.
Wow.
And so
create jobs that way.
Exactly. An economist could say, well, I think we should kill all the bees, right? It's nothing against the bees personally, but it just makes economic sense because it'll create jobs, it'll grow GDP, and generate tax revenue, right? And so really, if bees, and of course people go, oh, that's satire, I don't really get it, or whatever. Those are the indicators they have. The idiot lights on the economist's dashboard are jobs, GDP, tax revenue. Now, if bees really did go extinct, what idiot lights on the dashboard of an economist's worldview say anything bad happened? Right? Hurricanes are good for the economy. War is good for the economy. James pointed out divorce is good for the economy. the worldview of economists is not working. Another story I tell is, when you buy a cup of coffee for $5 at Starbucks, you get a little paper receipt. And if you use a credit card, that little transaction could live on computers for a long time. And in the hour it took you to buy and drink that cup of coffee, a species likely went extinct. And you didn't get a receipt for that. And we probably didn't even name the species.
So I think we should say that not all economists are bad. I think 90% of economists give the rest of them a bad name, don't you think?
I like Joseph Stiglitz. I like Herman Daly. I like Georgescu Rogan.
There are a few.
There are some good economists, and I sometimes agree with Krugman. But for the most part, I think there's a great book by Kate Raworth called Donut Economics.
Oh, yeah.
And they have embedded this idea that, the invisible hand, how many economists does it take to change a light bulb? None. The invisible hand will do it for us. And there's the circular economy. There's mythology that is completely not substantiated by empirical observations, right?
Yeah.
And that is embedded in the way people think. And even with my urban sustainability group, a lot of them think that people know what they want. They know how to utility maximize. They're rational. They have all the information they need. And we just have to go ask people what they want. And what they want will produce the right outcome in an invisible hand-esque kind of way. And to me, I've argued with James, it's like the pilot of the plane coming out into the cabin and saying, well, one of the engines is on fire. We got a heavy crosswind and one of the landing gears not coming down. What do you guys think I should do? Right? Right. People, we need leadership, particularly on complicated things like climate change, like species extinction, like ecosystem resilience, where this is the death of expertise question. There are people that know better. I don't want to ask the crowd at a Red Rocks concert what I should do about my chest pain. Right? I want to go see a cardiologist, I hope, or whatever. There are experts that have more information. And in a human lifetime, we can only accumulate so much information. We can't be brilliant in all domains.
But getting back to the question about Richard Branson, I think people are looking for the white knight. People are looking for the Tony Stark kind of Iron Man billionaire to ride in and save us. And I think that's Elon Musk is riding that wave, and I think he's doing good things with electric vehicles. That's a really good initiative, and I think it's coming from a good place, that he wants his legacy, and some of these people want their legacy to have been that they used their wealth for good. And people are looking to that. That's who...
Heropreneurship.
Going to eliminate traffic congestion in Los Angeles.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, there's these heropreneurs that, you ask them, should we tax you more? The Bill Gates, and it's like, no, I can do better. I can create a foundation that can solve all those problems that the government can't solve.
Right.
And I actually think they're arrogant and they're wrong, right? It's unbelievable, the arrogance of some of these people with astronomical amounts of wealth. I can solve those problems better than you can. And they usually create a little foundation, and the problems that they choose to solve get smaller and smaller because they need a quick return to show them how brilliant they are at, whatever. And they don't really address the big, challenging problems.
And I think where it breaks down is that, so getting to the sort of the space colonization, and it's amazing how often this sort of gets used as the kind of conversation ender. Like, well, we're just going to have to get off this rock. And we actually need to call bullshit on some of this stuff and say, look, I'm an engineer. I understand physics, and I understand how much fuel would be required to get us somewhere. And if we can get a team of people to Mars, look at the movie The Martian. I think I really liked that because it actually, I don't know if you've seen that film with Matt Damon. What I really liked about it was that the crew that buggered off back to Earth, they were in flight for something like 9 months or 12 months or something. And I thought, finally, something's actually realistic, that they're not just sort of jump off Mars and 3 days later they're in Washington, D.C. talking to the president.
No warp drive there.
No warp drive. And that was actually a real problem because that was what meant that Matt Damon had to stay for such a long time in that little pod trying to grow his potatoes with his own excrement. And it's like, finally, you've actually got something that is vaguely
representative reality
of what it might be like. This idea that we'll somehow get a private spaceship that is vastly more efficient than a publicly funded space exploration, and we'll get a team of people to Mars. They'll suddenly start terraforming the planet, and within a few decades we'll have
a new Eden.
Crops growing there and gazelles sort of prancing
around,
through the Martian wilderness.
Well, if I get to travel with Jennifer Lawrence, sign me up. I'm going.
So, look, I think we've got fantasies of the future, and they're propped up by this sort of hero worship of these billionaires, and it's all intertwined with cultural sort of mythology around comic book superheroes, and that is really getting in the way of us being realistic about the future and what it would really mean and the time scales. Let's suppose that we do have a future in which trips to Mars become a reality with humans, and colonization does begin there. It's going to start with little pods, little sort of self-contained things that have air purification, recycling of water and nutrients, drinking our own urine, and that's where it'll start. And that's maybe there'll be a few decades of that sort of getting better and bigger, and a few more trips, and we'll end up with a little colony of scientists on Mars, a bit like the groups of scientists we have in Antarctica. You know, if it was possible to make a go of it colonizing Mars, then it would be infinitely easier to make a go of it expanding into Antarctica. I'm not at all suggesting that's what we should do, but no one's talking about that. No one's saying we're running out of land in North America, we're running out of land in India and China. Let's go and start building cities in Antarctica. At least you can breathe the air there if you warm it up. At least there are penguins and seals you could eat. And, you could build high-tech greenhouses that are heated that you could grow crops in without needing to sort of bring in ridiculous amounts of sort of external atmospheres and things like that you would need on Mars. No one is credibly talking about that, and nor should they. It's a stupid idea.
You'd have to worry about the thing, wouldn't you?
So
the sci-fi movies come back.
So if we get to Mars and we start these little pod communities, we're talking many decades of people experimenting with that, and at most it might end up being a little sort of pod metropolis of scientists taking samples. No one's
going to want to live in those tiny houses.
They're not. That's right. No one's going to be able to breathe the air. We're not going to have any sort of technology that can convert that CO2 atmosphere into oxygen. It's too cold for liquid water, etc. So you're not going to create this Eden on that planet. It's too far away from the sun, among other things. So even if we got somewhere close where we could start shipping sort of dozens or even hundreds of people to Mars to try and take the pressure off the planet that will by then have 10 billion people on it, the time frames, we're talking many, many decades, and we're already at planetary boundaries now. So there is no credible way to envisage a future where space colonization takes the pressure off this planet.
Yeah.
The size of a spaceship alone that could take significant numbers of people away from this planet to create the space we need. I mean, think of the biggest cruise ships.
Garrett Hardin has written papers on this. I mean, it's like...
Right.
That's the rate we're adding people on the planet. Right. Can we send that many people off to Mars? Come on, forget about it. Yeah. It's crazy.
Think of the space shuttle. Now think of something the size of the Queen Elizabeth II, like a huge ocean liner that can take a few thousand people. Think of the difference in size between those two vehicles. If you could somehow operationalize a space launch of the QE2 that could take maybe 5,000 people in it, now think of the technology that would be required. And that would be enough to take 5,000 people off a planet that has 7.5 billion.
So we can't even save the 1%.
We can't even save the 1%. No. The 1% are stuck down here with the rest of us.
Those dystopia movies are flawed.
Right. So, I mean, this is... Some people get stuck into me about being sort of too quantitative. That's my engineering brain. But we've got to actually start shoving numbers down on the table. And... we, in the car on the way here, we were talking about the law of large numbers, and part of the issue is that billion, million, trillion, these numbers all sound the same. Whether you're talking 7.5 billion, 9 billion, it's a bit of a hard number for people to grasp. But if we can find, and this is what Al Bartlett did so eloquently with his basic arithmetic on exponential growth, and I think we need to come back to that. Step out of the complex global climate models and just sort of show people basic arithmetic and come up with these simple narratives that actually show space colonization is never... There's no realistic way in which we can ease the population pressure through space. And that should shoot that argument down and get us back to the fact that we have one planet here. We've got to get it right. And maybe once we get it right here and we're actually living in harmony with nature and we're all holding hands and singing songs and skipping through the wilderness, maybe that's something we could export to the galaxy.
That's kind of a nice finish. So, class, to summarize, climate change is only one of many crises that we're creating as we expand the scale of the human enterprise, and it kind of seems like the most urgent. But resource limitations and toxification of the planet, we haven't figured out a way to synthesize more fresh water. We're going to run out of gas too, apparently. We will even run out of the materials we need to power a renewable energy-based society if we keep on multiplying. We're going to run out of Soylent Green. So we have more work to be done than we're not going to solve our problem by, driving electric cars and putting solar panels on our roofs.
It's a good thing to do.
Yes.
Basically, there's no credible set of technologies or ways to somehow tweak the economics through the circular economy or even the well-being economy. There's no combination of elements we can assemble that allows for the continuation of this expansionist mindset and culture. And what we fundamentally need is cultural change to embrace a future and figure out how to thrive and enjoy a future that's not based on growing.
Well, let's go get some lunch, and I'll share with you how I've solved the problem and figured out completely what kind of messaging it takes to
Excellent.
Convert our growth-obsessed culture. I've got it all figured out.
Oh, wow. Why are you holding out on us?
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
James Ward, Paul Sutton, I cannot thank you enough. Maybe we can reconvene virtually from time to time for further conversations.
I'd love to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would be neat.
Sign me up.
You guys are a couple of smart guys, so it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, don't forget to explore all these issues at growthbusters.org. And I might mention that the film, Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth, is scheduled to be screened in my hometown of Colorado Springs on April 8th in a special pre-Earth Day screening hosted by the Independent Film Society of Colorado. I want to give them a shout out and thank them for that. And a nice little extra feature is after the film, there will be a panel discussion. I'll be on the panel. A Colorado Springs City Councilor will also be on the panel, plus a representative of the real estate development industry. So that conversation is going to be very, very interesting. Lastly, please subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And also, if you think that this podcast is important, you can help other people discover Growthbusters by rating the podcast and giving us a review. Well, that's it. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.